Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Hammer Museum. I'm Claudia Bester. I'm the Director of Public Programs here, and I want to welcome you all to tonight's program called An Indigenous Present, Indigeneity in Made in LA 2023. And apologies for the slight delay. We had a missing item backstage. I want to thank our co-presenters, the UCLA American Indian Studies Center, for their support, and especially to Shannon Speed. Tonight's program has two parts. We're celebrating the launch of the new book, An Indigenous Present, conceived by artist Jeffrey Gibson. And we're going to talk about the Hammer Museum's 2023 biennial Made in LA from the perspective of Indigenous intersectionality. Our guest speakers tonight are four Made in LA artists, Teresa Baker, Melissa Cody, Ishi Glinsky, and Esteban Ramón Pérez, and artist Jeffrey Gibson, and the Made in LA co-curator Pablo José Ramírez. So I'm going to give a brief bio for each participant, and then I'm going to let them take it away. Artist Teresa Baker comes from the Mandan Hidatsa Native American tribes. She has had recent solo exhibitions at the Scottsdale Museum of Contemporary Art, the Art Museum of Southeast Texas in Beaumont, Pied de Terre in San Francisco, Interface Gallery in Oakland, the De Boer Gallery in Los Angeles, and Gray Contemporary in Houston. She's been in group exhibitions at Ballroom Marfa, the Marin Museum of Contemporary Art, and the Yerba Buena Center for the Arts, the De Rosa Museum, the Wattis Institute, and the Luggage Store Gallery. Baker was the 2020 Native American Fellow at the UCross Foundation in UCross, Wyoming, and she's been an artist in residence at McDowell in New Hampshire and at the Headland Center for the Arts in Sausalito. She's a 2022 Joan Mitchell Fellow and was artist in residence at Fogo Island Arts in Newfoundland in 2022. Baker received her BA from Fordham University and an MFA from California College of the Arts. Artist Melissa Cody is a fourth-generation Navajo weaver. Her tapestries embody a harmonious blend of tradition, history, and contemporary elements. Using a traditional Navajo loom, she weaves classical patterns into intricate geometric overlays with captivating color schemes. Her art is shown in numerous museums and galleries worldwide, including the Stark Museum of Art, the Museum of Contemporary Native Arts, the Navajo Nation Museum, and the National Gallery of Canada. She earned a bachelor's in museum studies and an AFA in studio art from the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Artist Ishi Glinsky investigates the traditional practices of his tribe, the Tohono O'odham Nation, as well as other North American First Nations, to create contemporary homages to sacred events and customs. These investigations often consist of a close study of the history and significance of a craft tradition, the committed apprenticeship of its techniques, and its assimilation or transformation within Glinsky's artistic practice. He has exhibited at the Museum of Contemporary Art Tucson, the Los Angeles Municipal Art Gallery, and Human Resources, with solo shows at the Art, Design, and Architecture Museum at UC Santa Barbara, These Days LA, Chris Sharp Gallery, and Open Studio Tokyo. Artist Esteban Ramón Pérez's practices utilize his experience as a professional upholsterer and intertwines cultural and artistic sensibilities of his Chicano heritage with the visual language of postmodernism, as well as issues rooted in postcolonialism. His work incorporates myriad facets of art history, subjectivity, spirituality, and social issues. He received his BFA in art from CalArts and his MFA in painting and printmaking from the Yale School of Art. Artist Jeffrey Gibson comes from the Choctaw and Cherokee Native American tribes. His artwork fuses traditional Native American materials with contemporary Western art, creating a distinctive visual language that challenges the exclusion of indigenous traditions from art history. His diverse portfolio includes garments, sculptures, paintings, and videos, featuring intricate handiwork with materials like beads, metal jingles, and elk hide. His paintings merge Native American elements with global traditions, reshaping the perception of Native American art through color relationships and grid structures. He's a graduate of the School of the Art Institute of Chicago and the Royal College of Art. Gibson has exhibited in institutions like the Denver Art Museum and the Whitney. He's currently an artist in residence at Bard College, and I'm thrilled to say that Jeffrey Gibson will represent the United States at the 2024 Venice Biennale. Hold on one second. So Gibson conceived of and edited this gorgeous book that we're celebrating tonight. It's really a monumental gathering of more than 60 contemporary artists, photographers, musicians, writers, and more, showcasing diverse approaches to indigenous concepts, forms, and mediums. Our moderator tonight is the Hammer Museum's own curator, Pablo José Ramírez. He recently co-curated the Hammers Biennial, made in LA, alongside independent curator Diana Nawi. Pablo's work explores non-Western ontologies, brown and indigenous histories, and the politics of non-colonial aesthetics. Pablo was the inaugural adjunct curator of First Nations and Indigenous art at the Tate Modern, where he played a key role in shaping the acquisition strategy and advancement of Indigenous and non-Western practices. So now I'd like to bring up our guest speakers and let Pablo begin the conversation. Please join me in welcoming Teresa Baker, Melissa Cody, Ishi Glinsky, Esteban Ramón Pérez, Jeffrey Gibson, and Pablo José Ramírez.
Hi everyone, good to have you here. And it's really, really good to be here with you guys. We were just saying backstage that it feels almost melancholic, and we opened the show a month ago, a month and a half. And yeah, like when we were thinking about this program and what we could do with Made in LA, Janelle also approached to us, and we started a conversation with Janelle and Jeffrey about an Indigenous present and how the idea of the book and the kind of constellation of concepts and the kind of the project behind it could somehow entwind or be entwined with some questions that we have been thinking of within Made in LA. And I guess that we were thinking, okay, how can we put this kind of like event together where we are presenting the book, where we are thinking about Made in LA, and then having Esteban, Teresa, Melissa, and Ishi here joining the conversation. And the way I think of this is, for me, Made in LA and an Indigenous Present works as some kind of portal. So this is like a portal that allows us, hopefully, to think of issues around indigeneity, diasporic histories, mestizaje, and why is that we are doing this? I guess that is just because this is a very important moment in artistic practice and how museums and collections are being reshaped by conversations around race and around indigeneity around the world. So one of the things that I guess is important to say is that collections and museum practice started to decentralize through a more kind of like sort of multicultural discourse in the 90s. And, you know, like all of this happened, like the Berlin Wall fell, and the parallelisms between kind of this moment of, this moment of multiculturalism it kind of works hand in hand with the opening of like market liberalization. So neoliberalism and multiculturalism have like certain parallelisms, and this has been happening since the 90s. But this moment it feels different. You know, we see a project like Indigenous Present, we see so many exhibitions discussing issues on indigenous art in the US, in Europe, and Latin America. So it feels like things are changing, and we are finally speaking within ourselves, within our own communities, and kind of envisioning what indigeneity might mean in this case, and how this entwines with some kind of intersectional view on diasporic histories, the history of Latino and diasporic communities in the US, and so on. So it's really good to be here with you guys, and I'm very happy and honored to have you join us. I will just say a few things about Made in LA, and I hope you all already saw the show, and otherwise you can just, I don't know if it's still open or you can see it other day. It's always full, so it's a good thing. People is coming to see the show. So Made in LA, as you might know, takes its ethos from a quote by artist Noah Purifoy inscribed in the Watts Towers. one of the first visits we did with Diana Naui, the co-curator of Made in LA, was going to the Watchtowers. It was my first time there, and somehow this sort of amazing kind of aesthetic public force was just really impressive, because the history behind it, like a Italian immigrant just one day deciding to get up and build for the next 30 years a set of like towers on his spare time. He was a construction worker, and then he would just come back home and work on this. So there is something about art as what I call the will to create, this driven force that moves people to keep doing things because we have to, because it's what allows us to live and keep our stories alive. And also behind that, it is the possibility of thinking of creativity and yeah, I guess creativity and art as kind of deeply entangled with our communities and with indigenous communities, with diasporic histories. There is something about creativity that connects deeply with our kind of like obliterated histories. And in a way, like this kind of form of vernacular aesthetics in the Watchtowers then started to manifest in different artistic practices that we would be seeing all around LA. So we would be in, I don't know, like East LA, Art District, South LA, Long Beach, and there were so many artists kind of connecting to tropes of vernacular aesthetics, crafts, and questions of indigeneity as well. So that's how we came with the title. And I will just briefly mention the works of Teresa, Melissa, Esteban, and Ishi, just so you have an idea in case you haven't seen the show. This is the work of Teresa, and it looks beautiful. Just here, like it's kind of like what is welcoming in G4. These big, beautiful abstractions with a base on astroturf and these very subtle materials, in some cases referencing kind of mapping and abstractions of indigenous land. This is another shot. Then we see on the back Melissa, Cody. They will tell us more about their practice, and we will have a chat with them. But I think something that really caught our attention, Melissa, was how you were kind of vindicating the idea of ancestrality and craft by means of contemporary art, and how you engage with some visual regime that it feels sovereign, in the sense that you are doing something that you are being accountable to a community, and at the same time you are creating something new. And that kind of like paradoxical place of creation was something that we felt very powerful in your practice. This is another view, same but closer. This is Esteban and Ramón Pérez. It's great to have you here. And something I think that I felt connected with personally was how you are uh, how is that you are taking distance probably with from some forms of figuration as well, and how abstraction, but also dealing with the materiality of leather in this case, allows you to tell a story. And in this case, we know that this story is connected to your own kind of family history and your dad working with leather. And finally, Ishi Glinsky. And Ishi, we have many conversations, and I think for me, and I believe for Diana, your work and how you kind of decided to take a stance in terms of how you relate to pop culture, and how is that you somehow appropriate and revert and sabotage like icons of pop culture in this way is really powerful. And in this case, also how your work becomes some kind of platform that allows action, like in this case, intertribal solidarity, as with this piece. So I think we were really moved by that. And so without further ado, I will also now pass the mic to Jeffrey, and you can tell us something about the book. And you can find the book also in the end. But yeah, just very curious to know a little bit about the project and the ideas behind. And also you think about this project as almost like a platform, like almost like an editorial, curatorial platform that allows you to have a conversation with other artists. So yeah, tell us more. And
For sure. Thank you. Welcome to thank you for joining us, and thank you to everyone who's here tonight. Um, Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I'll first start by saying I'm just really proud of the book. It was a really long process to bring it from conception into the world. It's a little over 2.5 years, and my co-editor Janelle Porter is somewhere here in the audience. Where is she at? There you go. And thank you, Janelle. And yeah, I think the book, for a long time, I think I grew up in the U.S. and outside of the U.S. in Korea and also in Germany as a child. And I knew I wanted to be an artist quite early, but I had that similar experience as a lot of people. I went to art school, and professors weren't really able to like direct me into like other artists who were working. There was always a short list of James Luna, Edgar Heap of Birds, and John Quick to See Smith, who I love and who I got to know and who have served as mentors for me. But I think trying to find people my own age, where were those artists working, is a challenge that's been with me since I was probably a teenager for sure. And and then also, I knew about other Native artists who were working where my families are from in Mississippi and Oklahoma, who I was not seeing reflected in the art world that I was looking at in magazines and books. And so as I got older, I worked in museums. I worked at the Field Museum in Chicago, and I was a NAGPRO research assistant, so working on Native American graves repatriation in the 90s. And really got really pulled into the world of anthropology and museology and archaeology as the terminology and the context to think about creative practices done by Native and Indigenous people. And for me, it just didn't reflect who I was. And so I think there was just a longing, for like where are we in this world that I think is exciting, that I think offers me freedom, that I think could be a place that normalizes me. And so for a long time, I thought, when is somebody going to make this gorgeous editorial feature on Native artists where our work isn't an illustration for an academic paper? And when are we going to get pulled out of the worlds of anthropology and archaeology and museology? When do we get to kind of extract ourselves from that just for a moment? And I think most of what I've done in my career has come from some degree of frustration and dissatisfaction with not being included in, and I've been included in a lot of things, but not always in the terms that I would want to be included by. One of those things being contextualized by other Native artists. And so the problem with that is that a lot of non-Native curators don't know how to talk about work made by Native and Indigenous artists because they don't know the context that we come from. And so I think, and we'll see what other people have to say, but there's a lot of kind of justifying how we arrived at our contemporary selves and looking for precedents historically that kind of explain how this makes sense, that we're a contemporary person, that we're an active person in the world. And so I think that was sort of probably the beginning of the desire to make a book like this. And I thought about doing a publication where I would have probably called up anyone on this panel and said, hey, I want to do a feature on you. And I just basically want to show your work really in a beautiful way with editorial photography, beautiful printing. I think that was really important to me. And then I looked into how difficult it was to make a quarterly journal. And I was like, I can't take that on. So I was talking to somebody and they said, why don't you make a book? And Janelle Porter included me in, or she actually organized my first museum solo show at the ICA in Boston in 2013. And I know she and her partner, Connie Pirtle, had been making books for over 20 years. So I called her up and I said, I have this idea. And within probably an hour-long conversation, we had kind of arrived at that I didn't need to be in the book, that this was really about an artist's perspective at looking at other artists. And that was the kind of beginning of it. And then Janelle actually told me, she said, well, that would make you the editor, and you'll need a I forget what you called it, but there was another term, and so I called her up later, and I said, if you'll come on board with me to make this book, I'd love to work with you on it, and that's how it got started. She asked me on that first phone call, who are these artists that you're talking about? And I rattled off about 45 names. We had 2 people decline from that list to be in the book ultimately. So that means that roughly 43 people who were on that original list are in the book. The remaining people who I put in the book were really people who I discovered during that process, or sort of like on the fence, like, do they fit in this book? Do they not fit in this book? And then also just kind of rounding out some of the ideas that showed up we were doing virtual online studio visits at the time. And so there are studio visits for every person in this book that are recorded. We recorded the Zoom calls, which is an amazing archive of just hearing people talk about their practices. And and I told Janelle, I said, also from a curatorial perspective, I want to get away from the formalism of kind of saying it's like, well, this is a yellow painting, we can put it next to a yellow pot, and I was like, because it just, that kind of formal style of curating that's about the formalisms of an object or of an artwork, I think indicates otherness very quickly, right? That you're not kind of coming from an internal perspective of the content of the work. And so that's what the studio visits were really helpful for, was to kind of think about, like, maybe they don't look like they belong together, but these are 2 different cultural perspectives that are about something topically, that they should be put next to each other for consideration. So I think that that was a really interesting thing. We made a few decisions that we didn't want to list everybody alphabetically. We didn't want to put 4 or 5 images in a row of each artist. We were really curating an exhibition within a book and within a book format, and there's lots of freedoms in that otherwise we couldn't do. I specifically wanted a big, heavy book. Partially because we don't have them. There are collection catalogs that are big and heavy, but just in terms of giving and prioritizing an artist's perspective with the work that they make, without kind of over-interpreting it, was something that we really were not finding comparable books that did that. And there's been a lot of work done for sure in terms of trying to rectify that. But and in fact, that's how I met our book designer, who is Sebastian Alben, who's also here in the audience, and his firm Otami. And Sebastian and I met in 2011 in Winnipeg. And I met he and his partner, Carolyn Monet, who's an artist who designed the cover of the book. And we just really hit it off. I mean, we talked about music. We bonded over Roberta Flack's Quiet Fire. And I just think that was sort of, it's amazing when you have experiences, when you're always defined as a minority, historically or culturally. It's amazing when you're in a situation where you're like, oh my gosh, we're the majority. For this one day, we're the majority. And I think that that's a very kind of healing experience to feel, and to give yourself and to be able to give other people. So I think that's really the nature of the book. And I met Ishi. I met Ishi just recently. I mean, we met before, but we met at Indian Theater at the Hessel Museum, and you came up and introduced yourself, I think, and I knew about your work a little bit by that point. But, and Janelle and I just had to draw a line at some point, because we could have just continued on and on and on and gone up to a number of more artists. But, and Esteban and I apparently met at Yale. And so, yeah, I think it's a really exciting moment. And for our contributors who contributed writing, we were not asking them to write about the work. We weren't asking them to interpret the work. These are people who have been active in the field for over a decade. And we just said, there's this cultural moment which is so clear. There's so much palpable evidence that the recognition of Indigenous artists is greater than it's ever been during my lifetime. So it was just asking them, from their perspective, what do they see happening and what brought them to this point? So it was everything from musicians to activism to queer and trans poets and politics and sexuality and humor and these are all things that I think if you are Native and you're looking at, you know, your family and your communities, you know that all of these things exist. But somehow our public perception, we're always still continue to be the kind of stoic, kind of tethered to certain notions about what our relationships are to each other, to the land, to spirituality, to culture, to tradition. So I think, you know, contemporary art for me just offered me a bubble where I could like risk failure. I could risk making fun of myself or just breaking rules. And I think that's something that alleviates this kind of immense responsibility that I felt growing up being a Native artist or identifying as Native. But I think I will stop there, and then maybe we can hear from you. Sorry, I slacked off on the. Yeah, yeah. Um, so yeah.
Um, I think that since we are talking about, indigeneity and how like Made in LA connects to it and an indigenous present, um, I would just like to open up and try to think about the concept of indigeneity and or indigenous art. And I know that it can be kind of like a sort of trapped. Um, but I'm saying this because for Made in LA, for instance, we realized at some point that there was a good number of artists that would self-identify as indigenous or belonging to some specific tribal affiliation. And but also we found that many of the artists were referencing indigenous traditions while also belonging to some diasporic community, for instance. So that brings us to the complicated questions of indigeneity. And that makes me think also on someone like David Garnou, who is a Métis scholar, and he has this essay where he is trying to think critically on what being indigenous means. And we can agree or not, but he has this interesting point that is like, for him, uh, and in being indigenous is sharing, it's like people around the globe that share an anti-colonial struggle. So he puts the idea of being indigenous in terms of like some kind of transnational project, and that would include then potentially also diasporic communities, like brown folks, like mestizos from Latin America, for instance. And so I'm opening in this way because I'm thinking of your practice, Esteban, as well, and how is that you relate or connect to these traditions. And we see it in your practice, in the work you have for Made in LA. And I'm just curious because I think that that allows us also to have a more kind of nuanced conversation and kind of opening up and thinking on indigeneity as some kind of lens to approach artistic practices and to approach the way we think of, like, the world and so on. So I don't know if you have something to say about that.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thanks for coming. Um, Thanks for having me, everybody. I we got together. What was it, like a week ago now? Just to kind of do a warm up. We got together at Cody's studio in Long Beach, and it was really nice. She demoed a little bit her practice, which was also cool. But we wanted to kind of figure out talking points before we saw your questions, Pablo. And so we were kind of just like, shooting darts in the dark. And one of the first things I told them was like a disclaimer, which I felt a type of way about being asked to be on this panel because I'm the only artist up here that's not tribally or tribal affiliated in any way. My relationship to indigeneity has always been this kind of like mythology that I grew up with that was being fed through a national lens of being Mexican. And I personally identify as Chicano. And so when I was I went through a phase of kind of like this self-education because I never took any Chicano studies classes. There wasn't anything offered in the kind of schooling that I was presented with outside of like, like certain clubs like Mecha and stuff like that. But that's more activities than it is a history or kind of like any curriculum. So I went through this kind of self-education phase when I was trying to get my hands on anything that kind of referred to Chicano history and ties to indigeneity. So I stumbled onto post-colonial studies, and um, in undergrad started thinking about what does it mean to decolonize my identity, decolonize my practice. So a part of that was to this idea, especially through the Chicano movement, was to prioritize the indigeneity side within a mestizo, which is a mestizo is in fact a mixed person, which in theory would be part indigenous, part old world, and because sometimes it's Eurocentric or even other diasporas, right? So um, my connection to indigeneity has always been obscured. When I started digging by asking my parents and my grandparents, I kind of didn't go farther than my great grandma, which it still wasn't clear if she was indigenous at all. Um, and my family has the appearance of indigeneity, but they're all mixed. My dad, it's kind of crazy. He has green eyes and a blonde mustache, but has this weird shaped head. And we say that he has like a nopal or like a paddle cactus on his forehead, and it's hard. It gets confusing. We're very racially ambiguous. So I kind of hit a dead end really early on, and then I started asking myself, well, um, what does it mean to have this connection to this kind of like nationality that's pushing this indigenous history, that's rooted in an indigenous history, but then still subjugates the 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 um, the kind of like the people that they say we're rooted from, right? So a lot of times what I try to do is in my practice is try to consider signs and symbols that I grew up with consuming, being a part of like my own mythology and my worldview that is obscured by religion, the news, and uh, criteria that I learned in schools and stuff like that, and associated with other things that I feel make up my truth, which is things I consume, such as like first generation Pokemon and etc. So yeah, I mean, I kind of opened up to them like that, and I told them that it kind of feels a type of way to kind of talk on indigeneity when there is no clear line to it in my subjectivity outside of nationality and guesswork. It's always been really complicated, but I've been interested in a complicated nuance conversation to push, because there is a lot of people who have direct connections to indigeneity. Me being a question mark, but systems of erasure have um, created a gap, as Pablo worded in his question. And that gap is usually developed through, you know, some of these systems are kind of like, um, you know, big words like genocide, like subjectification, pretty much like the kind of like the destruction of like religious and cultural institutions and stuff like that that create this distance from this ancestry, right? And often ancestry is rooted or kind of like connected to understanding of like belonging and even land. So I've always been interested in like kind of juggling these more I mean things that are considered to be um, ethnographical, even like but pairing them and also I'm losing my words a little bit, but I'm interested in kind of like combining symbols, present, past, and even futuristic to kind of create new meanings and kind of open up conversations. Hope I answered your
Yeah,
question.
no, it's in thinking through that, like I would just bring something that probably needs. This is something that probably needs a little more of context, and one of the reasons for this is that like I think sometimes in the U.S. conversations are very kind of like enclosed to very specific dynamics, and it's such a big country, right? And there is so much to see and so many things going on. When we did Made in LA, we did the first kind of selection of artists. We had like a list of like around 80, and and at some point we thought about demographics, because at some point you do it, right? Like you just see what is the kind of profiles that you have in the artist list, and we realized that most of the artists were non-white artists. So we had like the majority was Latino or Latinx, brown, and indigenous and black folks. And this was not a decision that was a priori. Like it was a decision that came uh, based on our observation of the kind of art we were looking at, and that was really it was just really very revealing, like to realize that we were looking at a group of artists based on their practice. We were not thinking on anything else in this very first moment, and that's because I think that most of the more kind of like compelling, thrilling art produced nowadays, it happens to be in the side of many indigenous, diasporic, and just brown folks. Not exclusively, but there is something going on there, is what I want to say. And so this kind of brings us to the question of art and the art object and abstraction and so on. The problem with mestizaje, I think, Esteban, is that in Latin America, this is a very difficult conversation to have. And one of the reasons is also that, for instance, why in Canada we speak about métis as First Nations. When métis is, it's a mestizo, it's a French settlers and indigenous folks. But it is First Nations, where in Latin America, in most of the countries in Latin America, mestizo, it's not indigenous. So the mestizaje as an identity is constructed as some kind of negation of your own indigeneity, which is part of the drama, of the tragedy of thinking of mestizaje in Latin America. My point is that I think that in places like Los Angeles, something else is going on with kind of rethinking your own sort of mestizaje or let's call it like brownness through a different lens. And that's why many artists are kind of reconnecting, I think, with indigenous histories in Mexico, Guatemala, and so forth. But then going back to the art object and the ideas of an abstraction. I'm just curious about like how is that you guys handle the idea of abstraction and how that connects to indigenous knowledges. There's been a lot said about how abstraction works as some kind of a strategy to kind of like safeguard knowledge, right? Indigenous knowledge. So the art object does two things. On one hand, it does the art thing. It's shown in an exhibition, and it can show internationally, and people is gonna probably feel something when they see it. But on the other, it keeps some specific knowledge and content safeguard. So it's meant to be seen and read and listened by specific groups of people. So I'm thinking about abstraction, and I mean, this probably relates also to your work, Melissa and Teresa. Like, how is that you think of this, and how is that you think of on abstraction in relation to your own work and indigenous knowledges?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. It's really nice to be here with you all. So, for me, I would say one of the ways that it's kind of the most obvious between abstraction and indigenous knowledge is through my use of materials, or some of the materials that I use, which the traditional materials I have been tending to use in the last 4 or 5 years have been willow, animal hides, deer, buffalo hides, and sinew, sometimes corn husks grown from Hidatsa corn seeds in my backyard. And so these materials are all coming from a place that I was raised to know and understand. So willow we used in our baskets, we used in our earth lodges, in our bull boats, for example. Animal hides, of course, have a variety of uses, but buffalo in particular, buffalo, of course, I'm from North Dakota, so it's used to keep warm in the winters. Also used for our bull boats. And just to explain what that is, that's basically our version of a canoe. And so the form inside was made kind of woven together with thicker sticks. And then we use the buffalo bull hides to stretch around and to make the boats. The corn husks that I use have a less functional significance, but culturally, or spiritually, are very important. And we had vast gardens traditionally on the Upper Missouri River. And so with that came a lot of ceremony and duty, especially for the women of my tribe around the certain spring, summer, fall seasons. So for me, I'm using these materials with that knowledge, but I'm taking them in this kind of abstract way, in a way that's different from how we use them. And I'm using them as a line, as a way for mark making, irregular shapes. But what's really important to me and special for me in the work, and I also hope grounds it, is that they're really carrying that inherent meaning along with them of how they were used and continue to be used in many cases as well. And one of the less kind of obvious ways that I use or kind of build the relationship between abstraction and indigenous knowledge is through place. I think a lot about my abstractions in terms of landscape, and that is because just kind of at the core of what I always return to is it's always about the place that I came from. It's always about these Northern Plains lands. And I was raised in a family where it was really important that we knew our creation stories and we knew how that linked to certain places from where we're from. I knew my sacred sites. I understood that we take care of the natural world, that it is alive, that it is a relative, that it is to be cared for. And through all of that, I think it keeps, even though I was drawn to abstraction and I was drawn to this kind of like formal material relationships, that kind of base has been really strong for me. And so I'm always really interested in how to bridge the two, and it always comes back to land as kind of that foundation to return to. And and a little bit of an obsession with like what the land gives and what the land holds, and then also a curiosity for can I bring any of those feelings, into the work, and can that kind of transcend into an art object? Can it transcend through a abstract visual language? So.
And following that line of thought, Melissa, I'm thinking again going back to abstraction and how um, the way that I think the canon of Western art has understood abstraction takes distance from any kind of form of kind of representation of, or kind of like world building. And when you look, for instance, at like Mayan textiles, you realize that even if it looks like abstraction, it's actually representing things. And very kind of like, like daily life scenes or ceremonies and so on. So I don't know if you can tell a little bit about that within your own practice.
That actually resonates really well with me because, a lot of what Teresa said is in the same kind of line and scope with the way that I create. There's a lot of references to home. especially within a lot of the geometrics and the different, scapes and ideas of depth and traveling. A lot of it resonates with home, and also, Dinetra, which is, our home and the Navajo nation, the Navajo land that we come from between the four sacred mountains. And when I think about, the work that I'm creating, there's always that connection between, one, abstraction, but also, the materials that I work within. It's, wool at the foundation of my handworks. And with the working of wool, it's also comes hand in hand with, knowing the natural world around you, with respect for not only, the living sheep, but also knowing the seasons and knowing how to care for your family, which, again, relies on everything to be in harmony in order for everyone to kind of have a fruitful life at the end of the day. So, just taking all of those things into consideration when I create the work, there's always that idea of knowledge that connects you with home, but you're also, again, thinking about the different regions, because a lot of my work pulls from different design elements that are specific to different regions within the Navajo Nation. So again, me as being, a Navajo woman, there are a lot of other people within my tribe who can also identify with my work, because they're able to identify with those specific regional patterns. And so I feel like it's kind of my perspective, not only with the individual, connection that I have to the work, but it's also bringing the work into the idea of creating new traditions, and in terms of creating work that's not only specific to myself, but also, a lot of the people who I represent.
And that's how would you draw that line between like that kind of continuation of the, I know it's like probably an impossible question to answer, but between the continuation of a tradition and your own kind of take on contemporary textiles.
Well, the primary field that I work in, it's called Germantown. So the Germantown revival style dates back to 1864, which is the Long Walk era of Navajo history. So during that time, we didn't have any, raw material in terms of the natural sheep, because they were wiped out by the U.S. Army when we were forcibly removed from our homelands and imprisoned at Bosque Redondo in New Mexico. So at that point, we were given, rations, and in those rations were blankets that had been milled in Germantown, Pennsylvania. So even at that time when we didn't have our, sheep material, we adapted. And so we adapted by using that wool, that plied yarn that was, aniline dyed, chemically dyed. And I feel like the work that I'm creating now is kind of like an elaboration of that, where we're bringing in modern day materials into the weaving process, but it's also a reflection of where we are now in terms of, again, being current and living people in the modern times, and incorporating, I have my studio in Long Beach, and I'm taking a lot of inspiration from, again, that's my home. So my work is reflective of my home. And I think having the ability to create work that's still considered traditional by not only myself, but understanding that we're not stagnant people, and that we're going to continue to make traditions, and new traditions are okay. That's a whole nother conversation about, again, reclaiming a lot of our perspectives and how we're talked about, and speaking for ourselves, and making sure that our own histories are told by us. So, bringing all of those things into the conversation, I really wanted to make sure that the work that I create is, again, kind of like a jumping off point for not only my generation, but the generations to come, in order for us to continue to be creating our new traditions, where if you think, in 100 years from now, what we're creating now is going to be traditional, you know?
And I feel that I have to ask you that question, Jeffrey.
That's me.
Yeah. um, and thinking about your own practice, how you relate to abstraction and even like kind of contemporary forms of design. And I'm thinking of this because I think that in many cases that is something that we expect, or in general, audiences expect to see when we think about indigenous art. So how you kind of navigate that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, for me, I spent so much time in collections, in North American ethnographic collections, and I think being able to look at objects and to talk with delegations of elders who came in and who could, we had one description in the catalogs of when the work was collected, right? So that's one description of what you're looking at, and when the elders would come in, they could actually read what they were looking at in a much more specific way, which oftentimes was completely counter to what was in the catalogs. And I remember people showing me, oh, you have to be taught that in order to read this object, you must turn it this way and you must fold this way. And then it tells you a story that if you unfold it, it's a different story. And they're directions, they're literally manuals for how to navigate space, for how to navigate ceremony. And I think what I found so fascinating was the way that I had learned about abstraction through like Western and European perspectives was that it was almost leaning more into formalism than it was into kind of specific content. So I was just kind of shocked that nobody had ever directed me to think about it that way before. And it made me also rethink the sort of disruptions in Native histories, cultural histories, and removal acts, and forced relocation, and genocides. That all of these disruptions, I just started thinking, who would we be? How would these traditions have continued had we not been disrupted in such horrific ways? And I think that that's sort of the commitment that I feel I have as an artist, is to sort of ground myself in place, ground myself in thought, really try to commit from allowing myself to be distracted, to feel, to communicate with the world around me, and to interpret it through, for me, shape, paint, material, a lot of the same materials that you're referring to here. And I think what contemporary art, kind of offered for me was a space to experiment, that you could, not everything had to arrive at at a resolution. And I think that that is so important because you you're constantly generating potential. I guess that's how I think about a lot of indigenous makers when you open up to experimentation. it, we're not always going to produce something today that can be used today, but you're creating a greater and greater context for potential of indigenous perspectives to form and to be articulated into the world. So I think for me, there's another kind of rule that I learned also in my early 20s, which was that you never copy anyone else's designs because they belong to them. And so this idea that it's like, for me, I'm always like, how many ways can I spin a triangle? And it's like, I still haven't reached the end. Like, I'm still like, there's a million ways to spin a triangle. But I keep returning to that because it's the thing that is so malleable. I can make letters from it. I can make images from it. I can shift the color eternally from it. I can describe land. I can describe stars. I can describe generations. And so it's this kind of, I don't know. I think especially as I've been practicing longer and longer, and as I get older, there's a kind of entitlement to authorship with these elements, and I think that that's something that is counter to the way that maybe, at least the way that I learned tradition as this kind of static practice that you either were of or you were not of. And for me, growing up, where I didn't grow up within a Choctaw community or a Cherokee community, just the refusal that I would ever be disassociated by somebody else from my ancestors was just an absolute stance that I had from the beginning. I was like, even if I'm a unique example of a Choctaw person, I am still Choctaw. I have always been embraced by the community. I've always been embraced by my family, by my chief, by the community in Mississippi. And so, yeah, just kind of like standing strong. It's like I am one individual of a Choctaw community that comes from Mississippi, from Mississippian culture, and that's my history that I get to look at and build from. So, yeah, I don't know. I think and I see that certainly in everybody's work up here. which I think is, to bring it back to the book, which is what was so exciting. These are people who I've watched because they were intentionally deciding to be artists, which I think for a long time, since, over the last 20 years, this kind of statement that there is no word for art in most indigenous languages. But I think because we live in such an intersectional hybrid world, I am interested in people like the people on this panel who have chosen to step out into the world and to engage in the world and also to engage as artists and makers. That to me is really exciting. So those are the people who have just caught my attention over the last 20 years.
Yeah, this makes me think of like accountability as well, and how you navigate between the community and are accountable for that, but also are navigating the waters of like contemporary art and speaking the languages of that and doing exhibitions and so on. Um, and I'm thinking like a few years ago I was in Guatemala and I was in this little ceremony in a place called Cerro Quemado, and there was this akej, which would be an elder, a Quiche elder doing a ceremony, but there were many tourists, and it's very common in my town. So he was doing the ceremonies with fire and doing the whole thing, and at some point he threw copal with also this thing that kind of like flames up, so the fire grows, right? And there is this relationship with fire, so you keep the fire alive, take care of the fire, and so on. But at some point, when he did that, he turns to me and he's like, and it was full of tourists, so he goes like, "They love this part," you know. And he goes like up, and of course, everyone was very impressed. So I was just thinking on like, how is there usually there is this sort of navigation between things that you're willing to reveal and things that you decided to keep for yourself and for your own community. Um, and this makes me think again on accountability and working with your own community, with other indigenous artists, and just also showing work internationally, for instance. And I don't know if Ishi, like, I'm very interested about like learning a little bit more about your experience working through your piece with other artists in the country, and what did you learn from that?
Hello, everybody. It's a true honor to be up here with everybody and to have the privilege just to hear a little bit more insight in everybody's practice. And for a second, I felt like I was in a really lit part of the audience over here. Yeah, I guess with speaking specifically with my approach to the work that I've created, I could speak to overall, my practice isn't necessarily always collaborative, but with this particular piece, it is. And within being within this space, there is a through line, and it goes back to a little bit of what I consider myself as having a collaborative approach with the past and present, and so tangible and untangible. There's this indigenous knowledge that I'm working with and sort of discovering, and whether it's a piece that I'm producing where it sort of starts and finishes with my approach, or if I'm working with somebody directly, having conversations with a Thanatham weaver or a Dene textile weaver. There's I solely don't want to speak to the past, but I do like these either hyper focuses zooming in on pieces of indigenous knowledge that exist. So by going to my cultural center, I'll be in a room with baskets and other special items where they can go back to 1,000 years. And looking at some of these pieces and doing my best to communicate to these weavings and to communicate that what my intent is and what my interpretation is going to be with these particular artifacts and on pieces, living artifacts, and so there's a couple of approaches that I do take when working and when I'm collaborating with folks. Say with this particular piece, I can speak to directly. This sculpture I consider almost like a two-part experience where when you turn the corner in the space, you're confronted with this pop culture, this slasher franchise image, and I'm hoping to start a few conversations. One is why is this so familiar to me? Initially, the mask, and also the place of indigenous folks within horror film. And if you think about the trope of how indigenous folks in horror, the plot line is an ancient Indian burial ground, and you have this spooky creature that exists because of its resting place on this ancient Indian burial ground. And so I wanted to start that conversation with this particular piece, and also by indigenizing this found object, to sort of communicate, what in my DNA is reacting to this particular image, and thinking about how different cultures and different realms of sacred usage use masks. And so by covering it or overlaying or inlaying on top of it with this resin to a technique that I was viewing of the Huhokam, the predecessors to my nation, the Thanatam, by indigenizing it, just thinking about and starting those conversations. And so that's something that I'm thinking about and trying to create this conversation, and that gives way to the more collaborative piece of this the sculpture, and it starts with a memory. And when I was participating and viewing powwows, the start of a powwow, you have the grand entry, and it's such a beautiful moment where I was envisioning this calmness, which is probably technically not quite quiet, but right before the powwow starts, you have, before the MC says, take it away, so-and-so drum, you have these dancers all queued up and lined up, and different ages and backgrounds, different nations, and they're all standing next to each other and just thinking about that. And I wanted to recreate that moment where you have different folks from different nations and ages, and they work within different mediums, and also just talk about, there's not just this indigenous person in the past, and looking at artifacts that, from this, long ago time, that they're indigenous folks making really rad stuff today. And so it's become a little bit more of my process. There was a few projects that I worked with where I reached out to other indigenous makers, and it was such a heart-fulfilling moment to talk to folks and just to hear a little bit more about what they do and why they make, and also just to learn a little bit more about other nations and what stories and what these symbols mean to them. It's just it's a real fire to get into the studio and to be in concert all onto this one piece. And so thinking about that is sort of where the starting point of where this piece came to. So.
And yeah, like I remember when you present us the sketch of the idea, and it's really incredible how you pull it off. Like it's it's a big undertake, and I think that this there is something about like a strategy of like sabotage as well, and how you are looking at pop culture icons, and by like oversizing as some kind of like a strategy, you are actually uh, sort of inverting the colonial gaze a little bit, and it's like like you become the observer as well. And I'm gonna just drop off this question that anyone, please feel free to answer if possible, and it's one of the things that have kind of worry me the most is that, as I said at the beginning, like contemporary art works as some kind of matrix that absorbs like different sort of expressions, right? So big museums, the so-called global museums started to decentralize their collections in the 90s. So you have committees like acquiring Latin American art, East Asian, and so on. And there is this sort of new moment on the last probably 10 years where also museums and art institutions and biennales would be, for instance, including more brown, indigenous, and black folks as like curators and inviting more artists. So that is great, and as I see it, this is the first step on a kind of still long road. Like someone asked me a few days ago, a student, not yesterday, from USC, like, like this is a new moment, and it is great that there are so many spaces for other voices. And the thing is that structurally there is still so much to do, and one of the, I guess, paradoxes that we are dealing with is that contemporary art enunciates itself as diverse and inclusive in order to be contemporary. But that inclusivity and that diversity, it's most of the time, not always, but most of the time, come from a place of universality. And I'm meaning like what there is, like there is this kind of centralization in terms of who is allowed to say what is meant to be included and what not. That said, I think that many artists and curators and practitioners in general are kind of like using these channels to do something that goes beyond that, that kind of exceeds the infrastructures by doing a show, by doing what you guys did for Made in LA and so on, what Jeffrey does. So I'm thinking about that excess, the space that, institutions, biennales open, and that space of excess that you use to probably do something that is not necessarily expected, that goes beyond the kind of the labeling of whatever space of inclusivity you are thinking of. I don't know if that makes sense. I'm just thinking of how is that we go a little further within our own practices, and what is the next step? If this moment is a moment of inclusivity, what comes next?
I can comment just to get a jumping off point, but I think one of the first conversations that needs to be had is like the reason why a lot of the shift happened was because the conversation about craft versus fine art. As Indigenous people, a lot of the things that we've created over our histories have always been seen as craft versus you know craft, folk art, or low art, as opposed to being high art. How are we seeing in terms of being seen as fine art in fine art galleries versus ethnographical subjects. So coming out of exhibitions where we're next to dinosaurs and cavemen, and into realms where we're actually being identified by our names versus our tribe. So there's been a big shift, I think, within even just the museum and gallery realm, where we're actually again having our faces being put next to our artwork. We're being identified by our personal identities, and our own stories are being told in a way that they're more narrative of who we are as individuals. So, just in that sense, there's a lot more of, brown people within the field. And I think being Indigenous and being in being an artist who kind of grew up as a kid in the museum world, I've definitely seen the shift in terms of that conversation. And, I'm 40 now, but, when I was in even high school, there wasn't really a large venue to be a practicing artist who wasn't doing, traditional work. It wasn't really common for Indigenous people to do work that was considered, contemporary. That was like such a foreign idea. So, being here in 2023, there's a huge shift that I've seen over the course of my career.
I was just gonna say, I mean, I was a kid of the '80s. I was born in '72, so in the '80s, I feel like there was this vision that the future was kind of mixed race, like tan, olive skinned, like brown, like everyone was getting along. Hip hop encouraged that. Hip hop was really very much embraced like a kind of multicultural perspective. Disco, like gay dance clubs, like queer clubs encouraged that. And so I think that for me, there was always this vision that the future was going to be brown. And then when suddenly it wasn't, like when I was, I kind of was like, oh wow, that was such a good idea. Like what happened? Like what? And then, but I think by that point, like something had been woken. People had like woken up to this idea of what was possible, and maybe there are generations and continue to be generations for whom the fear of difference isn't sort of like put into their core DNA. They get to experience sort of that, that we're greater than the sum of our parts in our differences. And I know it sounds really kind of optimistic and I hope not naive, but that really got me through so many things, and I think then in terms of like art, I credit a lot to Thelma Golden and her kind of inclusion of Black artists in the biennials, and quite honestly, the flack that she took for her decisions, and then to go off and to start Studio Museum. I moved to New York in the fall of '99, and I remember Studio Museum of Harlem was such a big shift. It went from being sort of a community museum that showed community members of Harlem and Black artists in Harlem. And that shift from the people who were hobbyists and craftspeople going into the artists who were coming out of schools and who were going to get their MFAs. And so I think that there's a lot that I think the native kind of indigenous trajectory in contemporary art is definitely building off of the way that Black African American artists here in this country, how that has developed. And you can't deny that it's in combination with the marketplace, with the proliferation of art fairs and of markets for contemporary art, which I think, unfortunately, I've taught for over 20 years. Most students, when you enter school, you think the way you're learning it is kind of the way that it's been for a very long time. But in fact, the art world changes so rapidly, so quickly, and it has over certainly since the time that I've been paying attention to it. So, 25 years or so. So that proliferation of the market, I mean, I just kept thinking, I was like, someone's going to make a ton of money off of Native artists. Like, but also you think, I remember like, I met Teresa probably in 2012, I want to say, was when I first knew about your work. I taught at CCA. Yeah, and you had gone. Melissa, I think I reached out to you probably 10 years ago at least. And and I remember just thinking, I was just like, I just knew it, like I could see it. It's like, these are the people, like these are the people who are going to do that. I don't know. So I think that there's the conversation that I have with a lot of people now is that I think it's up to us to keep it going, because I think we would be foolish to think that there are saviors in the art world who are going to come and save us. I think that that's not going to happen. I think it might be a momentary thing, but also historically, if you look at the history, American history, 20th century history of when the interest in Native people has happened, it's about every 20, 25 years. There's sort of like this moment of like turquoise becomes in fashion, and like going to the Southwest becomes in vogue, and like wearing serapes happens, But it remains in fashion and entertainment. And I think this time, I want to think that there's enough of us in positions that I hope, that's I think one of the greatest successes of the book is I always believed this is an art project to create an inflection point. This is not about selling a book.
Can I add to that? Oh, not necessarily, but to answer your question a little bit, because I was thinking about how you were talking about universalities, and then after universality became like representation, representation became important. And I want to believe that after representation, representation ended up creating umbrella words like Latinx, which a lot of people of the Central American diaspora don't necessarily identify in or feel like it's a good label to describe them. I want to believe that specificity is next, a specificity that kind of sees people and artists in a lens of nuance, of complexity, of even commonality, that it kind of breaks down these walls of expectation and these stereotypical lenses, and yeah, I because I also thought the future was brown too, and
Yes, it is
yeah, and
actually.
it's
Just let's be clear.
mestizaje is just a fancy word for brown. Like it's mixed, a mixed race. People are mixing all the time. Fusion food. We're eating it, we're consuming it daily, TV, entertainment, whatever. So I believe in that too.
Yeah, no.
I thought you were going to say.
I just wanted to say that a lot of what you all said has resonated, and I don't know what's next, but I know I feel excited about what's happening in this moment, and I feel excited about the amount of Native artists I see doing really exciting things, and I didn't know about abstraction. Of course, there is abstraction in the tribes that I come from, but it's different. Its use is different. And so, Jeffrey, I don't know if you knew this, but I learned about your work when I first moved to New York City, and it was such a big deal for me to see another Native abstract artist, like in the kind of like contemporary, New York world, because I was so excited about that. And there is kind of a boundlessness that you talk about. Like I think within abstraction, there's just a lot of room to move, and sometimes I like to think a sense of freedom in that language a little bit too. So yeah, but I feel optimistic about what's happening. So
Yeah, there's been these peaks and valleys of interest within indigenous art, and you think about what the intent are of the interest, and going back maybe every 20 years or so, uh, and before that, it could be spoils of war and this like collection of a commodity, and it's uh, it's nice to see other indigenous folks today holding this space and really breaking barriers and having like with Melissa Cody's approach and practice is this taught for decades within your family approach of looming and weaving, and in the past it seems like that folks would just want to compartmentalize things and just call it folk, and sometimes to me folk can almost be a four-letter word of like how mistreated it and how dumping this like decades and thousands of years of like knowledge of how to produce a textile, the science that's involved with keeping animals alive in order to obtain the wool and dye the materials. There's just this like beautiful history of and knowledge that's passed down, and it seems like folks' attention these days is a little bit more focused. Where sometimes it seems like when you're talking about your practice or your work, people would kind of get this like glaucoma over their eyes and just like sort of check out. And now folks, I think, are having a little bit more of an appreciation and understanding and listening and actually humanizing the stories that some indigenous artists are carrying today within their practice. And but it's also just not solely about the past. A lot of folks don't necessarily are producing work that fully goes back decades.
I think that there's also really exciting. I think there are, and Melissa, you're an example of this, but people who grow up with makers as their family and your parents. And, I definitely, my parents were not artists and didn't know how to advise me in my choices. But I think I see that a lot with like other artists who, mainly in the Southwest, whose parents were artists who did Indian market for like the past like 30 years. And they've grown up, seeing this and hearing all of the kind of work that their parents had to do. But yeah, they've traveled, they've gone out into the world, and I think it seems like the obvious next step for them, right, is to like go engage with the world with the tools of what they learned from their families. And I think, yeah, I'm always amazed that, even with the most kind of atrocious kind of genocidal histories of Native people, they have always continued making things. Always. Just never stopped.
Yeah, and just like you said, we've always been creating, even during, the most dire of times during our histories, like the Navajo and the Long Walk. A lot of the most dynamic pieces came out, which were samplers, where all of the traditional patterns were put into one composition because all of the people had been rounded up from all corners of our traditional homelands. And, as Jeffrey said, I grew up, 4 or 5 generations before me were all weavers, and I created my first textile when I was 5 years old. And, I've created 2 to 3 textiles every year since then. And the idea of, am I an artist was never a conversation that I ever had. It was just, I've always been an artist. So, coming from a family where it was always just an assumed title, and then having it pointed out, by a lot of other members of my community, like, wow, you're an artist. Like, yeah, like you can be too. And it just blows people's minds that, there's this other realm outside of traveling every day for a couple of hours to their 9 to 5 job. Like the idea of creating artwork and being creative every day, and being able to kind of like support yourself on something that was kind of seen as like second class to everything that was important in your life. Like it's a very different way of thinking, and I think it was a very refreshing way of thinking, because we've never had the kind of flexibility to think outside of like necessities, providing for yourself, food on the family, not only your nuclear family but extended relatives. Is everybody okay? Can we live? And the idea of taking that and coupling it with art, and actually being able to have a certain level of comfortability in terms of creating was like an idea that was very often to left field. That wasn't something that was tangible. But I feel like our current generation is very much so grasping onto the idea of I'm an artist. And it's very, very, refreshing, and it's also very inspiring to me, because, I came from a very long weaving career as a kid, with never understanding that, weaving was not done just, as a utilitarian form of creating things for the household, or for putting food on the family, putting food on the table for the family, like my mother did. And it now kind of flipping, where, it's a creative outlet.
Thank you, Melissa. Yeah, I think that speaks to how we started this conversation around like this kind of very vital force within communities, indigenous communities, this kind of like will to create, as a kind of like a driven force. You need to do things, and that allows you to continue, like the sort of reproduction and continuity of life. Which is relates to what you were saying, and I think that this is a good way to probably open to some Q&A. So should we do that? Yeah. Um, yeah, please.
outside of being in and outside of fashion for the institution?
For me personally, as far as surviving, I can answer that question. Is my practice gives me such purpose, and I have worked sort of, I've for the last 10, 12 years, I've had shows here and there and wonderful supporters, but really it's just been me going into my studio, and I just work, and I believe in the work that I'm doing, and even when no one is watching, I just continue to make, and it doesn't matter if it's being shown or not, but I have a process that I have to kind of answer to, and to continue to understand.
I personally don't know when Chicanos have ever been in fashion, outside of, attire for Hollywood and, lowriders and stuff like that. Harry Gamboa Jr. coined the title for a LACMA show of post-Chicano movement art, which he dubbed Phantom Sighting, which is, I think, very appropriate, of this kind of moment where this these people are seen, but then like disappear almost immediately. Oh, shout out to you! Thank you. That was a very inspirational show. So, so I'm preaching to the choir then. Yeah, I mean, my thing is, I mean, and to kind of go on that kind of tangent of thought was that I know that some artists have used the maybe the strategy of disassociating from identity. Even Thelma in the early 2000s was kind of going for like a post-black moment, which was, this post-identity, and with Obama coming in, it was like this understanding or this idea of like post-racism, and it was almost like a moment of trying to get rid of these identity labels and associations. And as I'm still an emerging artist. This was kind of like a really great opportunity to me. This was on the bucket list. Let's put it that way. And I didn't expect to hit it so soon. And I'm very grateful to be up here with y'all because these are fantastic artists. But the struggle continues. And I don't and in vogue is it's fleeting, and who knows if there's any really real depth to this kind of visibility, and even for like this quote unquote brown moment.
I oftentimes think about, like I think a lot of people, before you're really engaged as an artist or in the arts, people think that artists, like, we wake up, we get inspired, we go do what we want to do, we have an espresso, we go read a book, we write a poem. I think being an artist nowadays is so different than it was 30 years ago. It's just like artists intersect with so many different fields right now. And I think I always tell students, I'm like, there's a big difference between someone who is an artist and someone who chooses to pursue a career as an artist. That idea of a career as an artist, I don't think really existed in the same way that it does today, 30 years ago. I think that is something that, you know, has really changed the way that young people think about pursuing being an artist. I don't know if I would necessarily say that one is better than the other. I would say that there are people who are amazing artists, who are really committed to a practice, who may never have a career, may never surface to the public. For some people, it's extremely painful to engage in something like this panel discussion. I meet people for whom this is not anything that they really do. And I have a lot of respect for them for doing that. I felt for me, I am an introverted, shy person, but I was like, Jeff, if this is what you want to do, if this is what's important enough for you to do, then I need to get over that, and I need to choose places of engagement, and I need to show up. And I don't think that's the only way to be an artist, but it's the way that I chose, and it's what I know how to advise somebody to do. You know, it's just difficult being an artist. Like for anybody, it's just hard. And I think it's a choice. And I oftentimes will say, like, I am an artist, but I also choose to pursue a career as an artist because it enables me to kind of move through so many different kind of seemingly disparate fields and conversations and people. And over time, I've learned to really love that kind of expansiveness. I think, and like, I don't know, like, I mean, I do collaborations with like fashion designers. I get kind of critiqued about doing things like, why would you do that? Like, you're going to go represent the U.S. in Venice, but I designed a handbag for Dior this year. It's like, and I just love the fact that that's something that I have worked really hard to be able to make the choices of doing what I want to do. And most people will, Julie Roberts I work with here in LA, always says I don't say no enough, like I work too much, but generally I think people don't work hard enough. That's sort of, so choose something that's great. So choose something you're not going to resent getting up and working hard for.
Well, I work very hard on the downtime. Luckily, and I guess not luckily, my work takes a really long time. It's very labor intensive. Each piece takes, a minimum of 3 to 4 months, all the way up to 8 months. I pull every thread by hand for my handwoven textile, so there's not really any downtime. And I think when the next, peak of what's in terms of like Native American artwork, I think I'm still catching up from the last peak. So, yeah, I think, like Jeffrey said, I'm continually just working all the time.
But I will say, the first time I saw your work, first of all, you can't become the level of weaver that you are if you didn't start at 4 or 5.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? There's no way to get that time. And so what you do is radically exceptional. Like, it's not normal, Melissa. You have to start there. And I think it's in the world of objects, whether we call them art or we call them weavings, whatever we call them, like that is something, that's your superpower.
Yeah, I mean, with the knowledge that I have, again, during my downtime, I do feel like, my upbringing and carrying this wealth of knowledge that I do have from not only, my mother, my aunts, and my extended relatives. I come from a really large family. My dad has 15 siblings. My mother has 13. So, coming from this large weaving family and then the generations, before me, I feel like I'm like a steward of knowledge. So in like my downtime, I do try to do as many talks and disseminate a lot of this information to the Indigenous community, not only from where I'm from, the reservation in general, but also, the community here, the Indigenous community here in LA County, in Southern California. So I really want to not just, covet and keep this information for myself and be really stingy with it, but I really want to be able to, again, have as many people learn from me as possible, because again, growing up in the 80s and 90s, there was a big conversation about, well, we're losing not only our languages, but also our Indigenous knowledges in terms of cultural practice, religious practice. And again, that was just like a fire under me to not only cultivate the information and retain it, but also be able to share it with the upcoming generation of not only weavers, but just people who have an interest in the textile world or fiber arts, and be able to, say that I did have some sort of reflective energy that, goes into the future.
Did you do market last year?
I haven't done market in about 2 or maybe 3 or 4 years, but I do like
You
judging
do the
for
herd,
them.
right?
I don't do
Oh, you
herd.
don't do herd. Okay.
Yeah, I grew up doing like art markets through a lot of the museum institutions in the Southwest in Arizona and then also New Mexico. So like my first markets were like in 91, if not earlier. So I've been competing, and this idea of being like an actual practicing artist was something that was instilled in me, as an elementary school child. So the idea of, making money from what you create, but also with that money you can buy school clothes. Like I was never able to get, brand name school clothes. It was always the tribal clothes that was given out by the chapter house on the reservation. You always got the generic shoes. You always got the generic brand, clothes. So with this kind of like financial freedom with weaving, I was able to kind of like unlock this other realm of like, wow, there's so much more out in the world that I can experience. And a lot of that I do attribute to, my parents for moving us around with my dad's job. So I did grow up a little bit near Oceanside and then also in Austin, Texas. So, this idea of like there's a larger world outside of, the small weaving community that I came from on the reservation, it catapulted me into like, wow, okay, I can be an individual person who's having these individual experiences, but also make my work reflective of those experiences and have that be something that can, again, hopefully inspire, the people around me.
I'd also say the other thing that's changing is I do sit on I sit on about 5 boards of museums and nonprofit institutions, and the reason I'm on there is to point their attention to people who are up here, to say, like, do you know about this person? Do you know about this organization? I sit on the Warhol Foundation board, and one of the best things that I think they did during my time on the board was during COVID, when there was a lot of upstart organizations that were native run and being started by people of color, that the foundation was like, they're not going to make it through these 2 years. Like these organizations that people work so hard to start are not going to make it through this, whatever we're looking at here. So they established like an emergency fund to like keep those going, to keep them going in a way that they could at least sustain through those years. I think funding models have changed. There are people sitting on boards now who are advocating for people in ways that they weren't previously. And I think, museums are struggling in many ways to figure out how to work with a new audience, a new public who I think is they must respond to. It's not the same art audience as it was 25 years ago. So I think there's a lot of power in advocacy within institutions right now, and I think the institutions know that they need those voices on the inside, not only on the outside. It's not perfect. It's not just. It's not equitable. But I know, at least the conversations I'm involved in, people are on the inside of the institution are very much aware that these are the audiences that they must appeal to.
Yeah, I don't really have too much of an answer because there a reporter reached out to me and was talking about or wanted to ask what my opinion about so many indigenous artists being represented all across these different galleries, and wanted to talk about potentially being a trope and talking about the near future. And it just for me it was just like, well, why remove this oxygen from this room? Like let's let this fire grow and just blaze before we start to talk about, well, what happens when the attention isn't there. And so but hopefully the future is brown, right? And the focus will have to be on brown artists. But it's difficult because, not to be a downer, but just any type of like scaffolding that you try to build is, you don't know what kind of wave is going to come and take it away. But it is a great question to. I'm happy you asked it, because now throughout my daily life I'll start to think about, shit, how can we get together to really start laying some foundation. And it seems like you're already in stride, but
mean, I will say the other thing. I don't know if people are familiar with Forge Project, but Forge is a new organization which just started 2 years ago. I'm one of their Indigenous advisors, and I can say they really are truly trying to do things different from the inside, and thinking about like Indigenous leadership principles and how to like embed those in the beginning of an organization like that. But I think that is an organization that simply hasn't existed yet and came into formation 2 years ago. And I think is hugely responsible for a lot of things that are happening currently. Has very quickly built I don't even know how many pieces are in their collection at this point, but is purely a lending collection, and has put all of that into practice. That's the director is Candace Hopkins, who I would say is probably one of the leading, if not the leading, contemporary arts curators working today. And so, yeah, I think there's definitely things happening now that have not happened before.
Another question. We will do the last one because someone is telling me we have to close. Yeah, it's time.
Hi, is this working? Yeah. Each of you have talked a little bit about your relationship with place, the intimacy that you have with place, and how that is enveloped in your practices. And I sort of want to ask about how that applies to Los Angeles, and how maybe that way that you cultivate place here in particular, whether that's something as personal as a garden, or something much more public. But I'm just curious about how you kind of cultivate home space here, and bridge that sort of with your other home spaces in the form of your practice or in other ways.
I'll start because you brought up a garden, and that's actually when I first moved to LA about 5.5 years ago. That's the first thing I did. Is I was thinking a lot about what does it mean to be here? What does it mean to continue to live in urban places? And the only thing I could do was just start a traditional hidatsa garden. So I grew our squash, corn, beans, sunflowers with our seeds, and I actually made my work outside as well next to the garden. But it was a way for me to kind of ground and understand how to bridge the two places. And I've continued that practice since living here. And my work is a lot about place, and it is about the Northern Plains. But I will say that I do think sometimes color shifts, like especially just like in my color choices, like LA has really influenced that as well. I've noticed kind of especially in the last few years.
Yeah, cool. I was born about 3 to 5 minutes away from where my mom grew up in East LA. She grew up in the Lopez Maravilla neighborhood, off of what used to be Brooklyn Avenue, now Cesar Chavez. And before that, she was born in Tijuana, migrated from Tijuana to East LA. My dad was born in Mexicali, migrated from Mexicali to East LA, met my mom. And before that, my grandparents on both sides migrated from Culiacan, Sinaloa. And so my connection to LA has been like being born really close to where my mom grew up, and then from there migrating. Well, I mean, not migrating, but moving around the Inland Empire. I never really stayed anywhere for longer than 5 years. I say I was raised in Rialto because I did my K through 12 there, but even while I was doing that, I only lived in Rialto for 5 years, and then lived in San Bernardino, Colton, Victorville, Rancho Cucamonga, Pasadena, and then finally back here in Boyle Heights. But growing up as a kid, East LA was my holy land, and I was consistently visiting because of family. Family was here, and to me, the Inland Empire is just an extension. It's like east of East LA. You know, it's just an extension. It's the same culture, a lot of the same people, a lot of the people that I met growing up. Kids, you know, new kids in school were, you know, when I would ask where they were from in a non-aggressive way, they would usually say LA, and sometimes it was displacement, you know, like things got too expensive for the family, or the kids got expelled from LA County Unified School Districts, so they had to go to the next county that, you know, maybe they had family in or something. But so to me, LA is kind of like a center point. It's home, and I lived in Connecticut for about almost 3.5 years, and even while I was out there, I was kind of back and forth from here to there. It really made me understand, or like have this different perspective of home, and it's a it's kind of something that I feel like uh, influences you in a way that you don't understand until you're out of it. For example, the sky is just so much bigger here to me, and the only other place I felt the same way was when I would visit like Baja California, which is pretty much the same kind of geography and space. So yeah, I would describe it as, you know, LA being a way to tether, like the only place I have roots, even though I've never really laid roots down here for a long time.
So I moved here in 2006, and I guess first off, is there any folks from here? All right, any Tongva, any indigenous folks? Yeah, shout out, thank you for letting us squat on your land. So I guess visually, I'm looking at something that does tie to Los Angeles and how it was incorporated into my practice. Thinking about what I would make for Made in LA, there's this, you can't avoid the Hollywood presence here. So that was an initial question of like, what would I make? And it did come, something did scream to me. But the texture for the hood actually comes from another process. There was another sculpture that I made. It's an oversized punk jacket, and that was speaking to whose land we're on and loitering. And when I was getting ready to produce this 11-foot punk jacket, I was thinking about what type of leather I would use, and I could patch it together, but that wouldn't make sense to scale as a 1940s jacket that I was trying to achieve. And then was thinking about synthetic or veggie leather, and I wanted to have the viewer come in and question what that type of material was. And so I started thinking about, well, let me just try to make leather. And it took about 10 years for me living in this city to become a Dodger fan. And and we're in LA. And I was trying to find this texture, and I was online and looking at leather textures, and I couldn't get the right high and low. And I felt sort of bad because I was playing hooky, and I went to a Dodger game, and it was a night game. And as I was leaving, the stadium lights were on the asphalt. And I looked down, and I was like, oh, that's the texture of the jacket. And I took a photo, and I made a stamp. And I felt that this jacket was speaking to whose land we're on, and thinking that this would be a great addition to this particular piece, because this shell that's on top of Chavez Ravine and the barrios that were like buried. And so I felt like calling attention to also the horrific sides of Los Angeles history and incorporating it as the texture, and it's the texture of this the hood. So the crackle that I made this out of an industrial adhesive on canvas is the crackle of Dodger Stadium parking lot. And there's also like some Dodger bats in there. Yeah. And Yeah, I guess I'll end it there.
I guess I'm last. In terms of home and making, Long Beach, I'm from the southwest corner of the Navajo Reservation, but when I up and moved and I came out to California again, I pretty much came with all my weaving material, just bins and bins and bins of wool, raw wool, wool that need to be processed, things that I had on my spindles, things that I was saving for the last 20 years, and I was going to use it eventually. So that's how I kind of made my little one bedroom apartment here home, was just surrounding myself with materials, because that was, again, a representation of my mother. We're a matrilineal culture, and we identify ourselves, greatly through our matrilineal bloodlines. So that's was like a huge tie that I had to bring with me here, and that's what I continue to again identify with. Now that I'm a mother, I have a 5-month-old and a 3-year-old daughter. I'm continually looking towards the future in terms of how their generation of being indigenous in an urban setting, and how are the teachings that I pass on to them and the spaces that they grow up in gonna kind of form them into little humans and productive members of society years from now. And how are they going to identify with and how are they going to define their own indigeneity, as being not only indigenous here, but also their Mexican and Guatemalan sides from their dad. But it's again, it's just kind of like a continual definition of what side of home am I trying to inundate not only my life but also my children's lives from here on out. Because when I didn't have children, it was specifically how am I gonna again pass this information on to people of my tribe, people who again want to be weavers or can hold this knowledge. And now I have 2 little bodies who I'm kind of funneling a lot of that too. And it's like I feel again even more, not necessarily pressure, but even more of a responsibility again to make sure that I package it in a way that it's well received for them. So that's me bundling up home for them.
Thank you, guys. So we have to close. We will continue outside. I would just take what Jeffrey said about this kind of driven force, like the will to keep doing things despite all odds. And this makes me think on this quote by Gramsci: "Optimism of will, pessimism of reason." And I think that there is something about will that goes far beyond, like these kind of dark modern times, like which we might be living the darkest time in modern history. But I mean, we and many others still here, and the fact that we are doing this, I think that it's a symptom that it's not that things are changing, but that it's about time, and the time of like diasporic cultures, indigenous folk goes far beyond back, like far back, and